Okay, let's look at some of the results then. Hopefully I've tried to convince you a little bit that the results we're going to show here really represent the best of our ability to demonstrate the responses of a well-tested model to some of the changes that I showed in the earlier maps. So how did GPP, NPP, and LAI respond to warming that was present in the NARR? Here I'm showing continental scale maps of GPP. You can see here the blue are higher, the red are lower. Southwest is low because of the drought. The north is low because it's cold. This is the standard deviation, and on the right is the coefficient of variation, and you can see the high variability in the southwest because of the extremely variable precipitation. It's less variable elsewhere. I didn't actually want to spend a lot of time on this, so I'll move through. Here's the same map for net primary productivity. So it's just showing various ranges, again, which we can test against site-specific estimates from biometric data. LAI, this is a key one because we can test this against NDVI. So again, these are all testable values at specific sites within those 50,000 grid cells. A lot of this variability in the southwest has to do with ENSO events. There seems to be evidence that GPP may be declining in warmer and drier ecoregions and rising in cooler and wetter ones. So here are the level 1 ecoregions of North America. This is as defined. This is sort of a general definition of ecoregions across North America. This is the percent that contribute to GPP. The main point I want to note from this slide is that the ones that are in blue are cooler and wetter. The ones that are in light red are warmer and drier. The blue ones generally have a positive change in terms of percent GPP per year, anywhere from 0.4 to 0.8, lower in some cases. The ones that are in red have negative values for percent GPP change, generally speaking, the range is, say, 0.2 to even as high as 1% per year, which is quite remarkable. So kind of a diverging trend in the response of GPP, depending on the ecosystem that you're looking at. And this arises from those processes that I talked about earlier, the direct effects and the indirect effects of warming. These are all summarized in these results here. Okay, these are more apparent in a map. The yellow to red areas indicate areas of increasing GPP, as indicated by these maps here, grams carbon per meter squared over 32 years here. And the blue areas indicate declines in GPP. And those are focused mostly in the west and the southwest, the drier regions in the west. So again, contrasting trends in GPP. Focusing on the Arctic, we see evidence of, this is kind of a smaller scale here, but focus in the Arctic north of 60, again, very strong areas here of warming, which seem to be corroborated by NDVI and by biomass studies, long-term biomass studies conducted at selective sites in the north. So, cooler regions tend to have greater gains. These are the processes that I talked about earlier. Warmer regions tend to have declines. And again, the direct and the indirect effects summarized here are the causes to which these changes are attributed. Now again, we can corroborate these with experimental results gained in these different areas, and this is stuff that's ongoing. Long-term changes in NPP and LAI, these are long-term changes in net primary productivity. Unfortunately, my grad student has a tendency to use different color scales for different attributes, which I'll have to get back to him about. But where you see the yellow to the red, this is long-term gains in LAI. Where you see the blue, long-term declines in LAI. So that's probably the best thing to glean from that slide. Can we pick this up in terms of continental scale gross primary productivity? What we observe is a decline in continental GPP attributed to major drought events. I want to come back to this drought issue that I talked about before. Here we have mean annual precipitation. Here's the drought of 1988. You can see now these are continental scale values. The droughts were primarily mid-continental events, but you can see even at a continental scale, there is a decline in the precipitation. That's the drought of 88. Here's the drought of 2002, 2001, 2002. You can see a dip. Then there's a big dip in 2009. I guess there was a drought then too. We also see generally rising trends in global continental temperature. This is a summary of those maps that I showed earlier. Here is the continental gross primary productivity expressed in grams carbon per meter squared per year. You can see there is a dip in the 88 drought. another dip in the 2002 drought, and another dip in the 2009 drought. So these drought effects are being picked up at a continental scale in our modeling work, but are we capturing the regional distribution of that dip? Let's go to the next slide. What we want to do is we want to test the extent to which we can capture the geographic distribution of the 2002 drought by comparing changes in model LAI with changes in, this is the Advanced Very High Resolution Radiometer, NDVI. I hope enough people here have experience in remotely sensed products. I had only very limited experience, but again, Zalalem grabbed onto this stuff and ran with it. So he, right now, in the bottom graph here, he plots out changes in NDVI between July 1999, before the drought started, and July 2002, which was actually the second year of that 2001 to 2003 drought. And where you see the red values, that indicates a substantial decline in NDVI. Where you see the light brown values, a much smaller decline. Where you see gray, there's really no change. And then where you see the green, there's a small to a large increase in NDVI. So if you look at the color, the extent of that 2002 drought is indicated in the NDVI record by that red to brown area that you see falling over a lot of Alberta, Saskatchewan, and then down south into the high plains and through the western U.S. Did we capture that in the model? To do that, we took the LAI model at the same time, really on the same dates at which these NDVI were expressed. We took our LAI, again from July 1999 and July 2002, at dates that corresponded to those at which these NDVI maps were generated, and we plotted changes in LAI, where the red indicates a substantial decrease in LAI from 1999 to 2002. The light brown indicates a small increase in LAI. The gray, in as much as you see it, no change. And then the green, small to large increases in LAI. And you can see, in as much as there's more or less agreement in the spatial distribution of some of these changes, it indicates that the model is capturing more or less the spatial extent and the intensity of that drought in 2002 in response to the weather data provided by the North American Regional Analysis and the soil attributes captured in the harmonized database from the US and the Canadian soil database products. So this is a little bit encouraging. We're able to now there's some areas where we don't get that effect, and again this requires further examination, or some areas maybe where our LAI effect was a little bit more than what was found, but that again may be due to those shallow soils that I talked about earlier. All right, we'll talk a little bit about the Arctic, just because that's where we're doing a lot of our studying. The changes, because of those amplified warming trends, the changes are pronounced in the Arctic. Here we took the spatial average of NDVI, the Normalized Difference Vegetation Index. That's a MODIS product, across the entire North American continent north of 60 degrees, averaged it out and expressed it in terms of seasonal curves, broken down into average values over successive 5-year periods. Here we take the LAI in the model over that same period of time for those same 5-year periods from 82 to 2006. And we want to see if there were any long-term trends emerging in the duration of the growing season, as indicated by the width of these curves here. It didn't really jump out as much as we might have expected, but there were increases in the length of the growing season after 1982 to 1986 that were apparent in the model LAI, in as much as that red line has a bit of a narrower trajectory than do the other lines that were gathered from more recent events. I should also just note our LAI here is total LAI. The NDVI LAI will be that which is above the snowpack. We need to change our output product here just to reflect the LAI that's above the snowpack. We'll do that for our next round to get a bit of a better agreement there. We also see to some extent the same thing in the NDVI data. That red line there is a little bit narrower than all the other subsequent lines, indicating there may be an expansion of the growing season both in the spring and in the fall in response to weather changes that have occurred in the Arctic that are being picked up in the NDVI record. Now again, we need to examine this more closely to see to what extent that correlation exists, but there seems to be a trend that we may be able to work with in terms of elucidating long-term changes in the productivity of ecosystems in response to warming, certainly in their growing season lengths. Another key question that's being asked of the North, and again I've got this in there because we're being funded to do this, there's a lot of talk of that the active layer depth of permafrost-affected ecosystems may be deepening. Now in the model we use the general heat flux equation to solve for warming and cooling and freezing and thawing of soils. We're able to model changes in active layer depth in permafrost regions through the application of that equation. What Zelalem has done here then is he's taken the change in active layer depth over 31 years from 1980 to 2010 on August 31st. That's the approximate date of maximum active layer depth in the Arctic. And he's plotted the changes developed from regressions of active layer depth on that site for all grid cells north of 60. And he's come up with this map here that shows in going from blue to dark blue, it indicates increasing depths of the active layer down to about 0.2 to 0.4 meters over 32 years. A few places it's going down faster, where you see the green to yellow. That indicates 0.4 to 0.7 meters over 31 years. He's got some deeper areas here just to capture some weird spots in here, but they're not really widely distributed, so we won't pay too much attention to them. The main point that he made is that active layer depth is increasing in most parts of the region at an average rate of about 2.3 centimeters per decade. Now there are actually long-term active layer monitoring going on through the Canadian Active Layer Monitoring Project, and we'll see if we can corroborate these trends. However, the first time I showed this map at an ArcticNet meeting, the people I was with, and they're all people who worked up in the Arctic, said, oh, it's not enough, it's not enough, it's faster than that. So there's a sense that active layer depths are depleting, are increasing. The depth to which thawing is progressing each year is getting deeper. It varies from year to year, obviously, but the long-term trends indicate, well, 2.3 centimeters per decade doesn't sound like a lot, but that's really quite dramatic. There are huge amounts of carbon buried in the permafrost. That carbon is now entering in the active zone, at least for brief periods of time in the year, and the consequences of this activation are taken into account in our modeling work, and we're going to try to corroborate those responses. They're partly responsible for some of the increased productivity we observe in the North, evidenced in the LAI record and in the primary productivity record. But this deepening exposes carbon into the permafrost. There are huge amounts down there. The estimates go up with every new survey. When I first started looking at global carbon balances, there was like 800 megatons of 800 billion tons of, 1,600 billion tons of carbon in soils worldwide. It's now estimated that there's about 16 billion tons of carbon just in permafrost soils. So that estimate's gone way, way up with subsequent developments. It should be noted, however, that all that carbon will also increase soil decomposition and mineralization, and thereby CO2 fixation. So there's a bidirectional response to that deepening, which needs to be reflected in the modeling work. A third response, of course, is the methane emission. We won't go in that today because I'm going to run out of time. But I'll just leave that with you. That's a key finding that we came up with. If we resolve that, the effect of deepening active layers into carbon exchange over that same time period expressed in grams carbon per meter squared per year. Note that the really big increases are really the big increases that we see overall. We see an overall increase in storage carbon of about 0.22 grams of carbon per meter squared per year gain in response to this warming. Most of that is occurring actually in the summer. We're providing evidence, however, that there's actually an increase in carbon loss in autumn. So again, GPP was shown to increase in all seasons, attributed to this 0.6 degrees C per decade increase in mean annual temperature and the associated deepening of the active layer, about which I talked in the previous overhead. But ecosystem respiration increased more than GPP in all seasons except summer, so there was a big net gain in carbon, a fairly substantial net gain in carbon in the summer. However, an increase in carbon loss was observed in the autumn, which partially offset these gains. And actually, interestingly, in a synthesis of the eddy covariance record, a similar conclusion was arrived at by this is actually a large synthesis study, lead authored by Piao in 2008. But actually came up with a similar conclusion based on this synthesized results from eddy covariance towers in Arctic and boreal regions. So again, kind of an offset, big gain in the summer, but possibly this increase in carbon loss with respiration in the autumn may be a worrisome consequence of global warming that has not been fully explored. If we were to summarize the findings that I presented so far, most areas in higher latitudes have shown increase in productivity, and again, we could corroborate these up from experimental studies in these high latitude. Here are some of them summarized here. There are a bunch that are coming out that seem to indicate that these rising productivity in higher latitudes associated with the more rapid warming that's going on there. Interannual variability, this is a really big subject. Year-to-year variation in weather causes very large year-to-year variation in productivity. We do track that with the modeling, with the site-level data. We can track it to some extent with the gridded data sets, so we're able to preserve at least some of that model accuracy using the gridded data. This interannual variability is particularly higher in the south and southwest. We're looking at impacts of El Nino events on the productivity of ecosystems. We do see them right up into Western Canada, and even the mid-continental boreal forest show responses to El Nino events. So these are quite large-scale effects of weather, or changes in weather, that we can use to test our understanding of the processes that they affect. We've done a lot of tests of model LAI versus satellite NDVI from the AHVRR. And generally speaking, we get fairly good agreement at detecting drought events in the Midwest and increases in length of growing season in the Arctic. These studies are ongoing. We need to firm up those correlations. Deepening of the active layer depth could expose a large mass of carbon current in the permafrost that could accelerate carbon release, but also accelerate mineralization and hence carbon uptake. So we're looking at how that balance works in terms of governing Arctic ecosystem productivity, including the methane, which again I won't go into today. Now there's an issue then, if warming continues, which it's projected to do, differences in gains of respiration versus GPP will determine if northern ecosystems remain carbon sinks or become carbon sources. We're looking at projections now over the next century to see how that will play out. Future research, we need to resolve some of those issues with the soil and climate databases to which I referred earlier. The soil organic nitrogen, the soil depth, those are two critical issues that need to be firmed up a little bit more. The climate databases, the NARR, particularly in the Arctic, we need to maybe revisit some of the weather data that's coming out, but that'll have to be done in the future. We are continuing our model outputs against measurements at well-documented sites, CO2 and energy fluxes. I showed you some of the CO2 fluxes, just a snapshot. We do that at a whole range of sites to really track whether the model can capture the short-term fluctuations in those at diverse sites across the continent. Plant biomass growth, crop and forest harvest, that'll be interesting. We can actually have access to the NAS database as well as the Stats Canada looking at harvest yields. Are we able to model those harvest yields as well as the forest harvest? There's a forest carbon inventory which has forest harvest from different areas. We also need to monitor soil temperature and water content closely. And then in the future, conduct model runs to the end of the century under different scenarios of climate change from some of the IPCC SRES scenarios. We have those racked up and ready to go, but we want to do some more testing here first before we start making those projections. Okay, so that's it. These are some of the sponsors. The ADAPT project is sponsoring a lot of our Arctic work. Misty MIF is sponsored by NASA, is really running the North American Carbon Program project that provided us with a lot of the databases, so they need to be recognized. WestGrid provides us with the computing facilities. We need to run, do 50,000 concurrent runs of EcoSys, but that's getting more and more routine now. It's now possible to do these runs and turn out a new set of runs. Once we get everything set up, we can actually crank this out in a week now. So it's just extraordinary, the advancing in computing power that enables this kind of work to take place. Okay, thank you.